Hey everybody, this is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, Volume 1, edited by Matgamna. The piece is titled Stalinism and the Marxist Tradition, and it's by Shachtman. A footnote says, This 1947 article is taken from The Bureaucratic Revolution, 1962. The penultimate paragraph in Part 1 was omitted in 1962, but is restored here. It's a little paragraph introduction to the piece by Matgamna. Was the idea that the USSR and the USSR's replications were a new form of class exploitative society, neither capitalist nor socialist, a radical revision of the basic tenets of Marxism? In 1940, quote, again and once more, ... end quote, which is on this channel by Trotsky. Trotsky had argued emphatically that it was not. Here, Shachtman develops those arguments. Okay, so here we go. Here's the actual piece. The theory that Russia is neither a capitalist nor a workers' state, but rather a bureaucratic collectivist state, meets an initial resistance from all Marxists, with some of whom it is prolonged more than with others. This is perfectly natural and understandable. We adopted this theory only after a long and thoroughgoing discussion. We have no right to complain when others move at an even slower pace, or even if they refuse to move in our direction at all. Those who resist our theory base themselves upon their understanding of the teaching of Marx. In a well-known passage in his critique of political economy, Marx wrote, quote, the bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of the social process of production. Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism, but of one arising from the conditions surrounding the life of the individuals in society. At the same time, the productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society create the material conditions for the solution of that antagonism. This social formation constitutes, therefore, the closing chapter of the prehistoric stage of human society, end quote. If capitalist society is the last antagonistic form of the social process of production, and if capitalist society creates the material conditions for the solution of this antagonism by the socialist society which is to be established by the working class, it is legitimate to ask what part is played in this Marxist system by our theory of bureaucratic collectivism. According to our theory, bureaucratic collectivism not only is not socialism, but does not represent a worker state of any kind. At the same time, we hold a bureaucratic collectivist state is not a capitalist state. Finally, by characterizing bureaucratic collectivism as a reactionary, exploitative, and therefore also an antagonistic society, it is implied that capitalism may not be the last antagonistic social formation. Paraphrasing Trotsky, one critic declares that our theory, quote, would signify that not the workers but a new bureaucratic class was destined to displace dying capitalism, end quote. He then charges that, quote, Shachtman ... invented and interposed a new class between the capitalists and the proletariat, thus reducing Marxism to utopian levels, end quote. The questions raised are serious and weighty. There is no doubt whatsoever that they involve an appraisal of the whole question of the collapse of capitalism and the future of socialism, and thus of the future of mankind itself. Such questions deserve thought in the most objective discussion, not on the low level of ignorance and demagogy to which the problem is so often pressed, but on the heights to which Marxism necessarily raises it. On these heights, it is possible to examine carefully and then to reestablish clearly the theoretical tradition of Marxism. This requires patient and earnest study, scrupulous objectivity, and the application of the Marxist method itself. Quote, in broad outlines, end quote, wrote Marx in the sentence immediately preceding the passage already quoted from the critique, quote, we can designate the Asiatic, the ancient, the feudal, and the modern bourgeois methods of production as so many epochs in the progress of the economic formation of society, end quote. Quote, in broad outlines, end quote, but only in broad outlines, exclamation point. Like many such statements by Marx, this must not be construed in the rigid, dogmatic, mechanical sense against which Marx himself found it necessary to admonish his followers time and time again. It must not be construed as an absolute truth. Marx indicates here the, quote, principal epochs in the economic formation of society, end quote, listing them, as he writes elsewhere, quote, in the order in which they were determining factors in the course of history, end quote. Marx would be the first one to reject the idea that every people in the world passed and had to pass from primitive communism through all the stages he indicated, one following in inexorable succession after the other and ending after the collapse of capitalism in the classless communist society of the future. Such a mechanical interpretation of Marx, although not uncommon among Marxists, has nothing in common with Marxism. Like everyone else acquainted with the history of society, Marx knew that there were stages in the development of communities, peoples, and nations which could not be fitted into any pattern of iron succession. Where, in such a pattern, would we fit those, quote, highly developed but historically unripe forms of society in which the highest economic forms are to be found, such as cooperation, advanced division of labor, etc., and yet there is no money in existence, e.g. Peru, end quote, about which Marx wrote. Where in this iron pattern will we fit the regime of Muhammad Ali, the viceroy of Egypt in the early 19th century, who was the sole owner of the land and the sole, quote, industrialist, end quote, from whom all had to buy, a regime referred to in one of the works of Karl Kautsky? Where in this iron pattern would we fit any one of a dozen of the antique Oriental regimes which Marx himself placed in a special exceptional category? The list can be easily extended. Marx found himself obliged on more than one occasion to protest against all the absolutist constructions placed upon his materialist conception of history, both by uninformed friends and uninformed adversaries. It is not without interest that many of his protests referred not only to interpretations made by Russian writers, but to the way they applied Marx's ideas as they interpreted them to Russia. Now, what application to Russia could any critic draw from my historical outline? Only this: if Russia tries to become a capitalist nation in imitation of the nations of Western Europe, and in recent years, she has taken a great deal of pains in this respect. I don't know, is this a quote? This is a quote, but it's not like recognized as a quote, but you can just tell from like what it is. Okay. Quote, now what application to Russia could any critic draw from my historical outline? Only this: if Russia tries to become a capitalist nation in imitation of the nations of Western Europe, and in recent years she has taken a great deal of pains in this respect, she would not succeed without first having transformed a good part of her peasants into proletarians, and after that, once brought into the lap of the capitalist regime, she will be subject to its inexorable laws, like other profane nations. That is all, but this is too much for my critic. He absolutely must needs metamorphose my outline of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophical theory of the general course, fatally imposed upon all peoples regardless of the historical circumstances in which they find themselves placed, in order to arrive finally at that economic formation which ensures, with the greatest of productive power of social labor, the most complete development of man. But I beg his pardon. He does me too much honor and too much shame at the same time. Let us take one example. In different passages in Capital, I have made allusion to the fate which overtook the plebeians of ancient Rome. Originally they were free peasants tilling, every man for himself, their own piece of land. In the course of Roman history, they were expropriated. Originally they were free peasants this is still a quote. Originally they were free peasants tilling every man for himself their own piece of land. In the course of Roman history they were expropriated. The same movement which separated them from their means of production and of subsistence implied not only the formation of large landed properties, but also the formation of large monetary capitals. Thus, one fine day, there were on the one hand free men stripped of everything save their labor power, and on the other, for exploiting this labor, the holders of acquired wealth. What happened? The The Roman proletariat became not wage-earning workers, but an indolent mob, more abject than former, quote, poor whites, end quote, in the southern lands of the United States. And by their side was unfolding, not a capitalist, but a slave mode of production, hence strikingly analogical events occurring, however, in different historical environments led to entirely dissimilar results. By studying each of these evolutions separately and then comparing them, one will easily find the key to these phenomena, but one will never succeed with the master key of historico-philosophical theory, those whose supreme virtue consists in being supra-historical. I'm guessing that's the end of the quote. Bad formatting here. Gotta say it. Engels, writing to the same Danielson on February 24th, 1893, added, quote, "I subscribe completely to the letter of our author, bracket Marx, and bracket ... end quote." Like Marx himself, his great co-worker found more than one occasion to protest against the vulgarization of the materialist conception of history worked out by the two founders of scientific socialism. Franz Mehring, reading from the Berlin Vorwärts on October 5, 1890, quotes from an article in which Engels found it necessary not for the first time and not for the last time to correct bourgeois misinterpreters of Marx's concept in the hope that it would be better understood by Marx's followers. Quote, "The materialistic method is transformed into its opposite when it is employed not as a guide to the study of history, but as a finished stencil in accordance with which one accurately cuts the historical path." To this declaration of Engels, end quote. To this declaration of Engels, Mehring himself adds, quote, "Historical materialism is no closed system crowned with an ultimate truth. It is a scientific method for the investigation of human development," end quote. Is not the attempt to cut the fact of Stalinist society into, quote, "a finished stencil"? Is not the attempt to cut the fact of Stalinist society into, quote, "a finished stencil," end quote, in which there is room only for capitalist state or worker state, a perfect example of the transformation of Marx's materialistic method into what it is not and cannot be? I like that. That's not in italics, so I'm going to repeat that. Is not the attempt to cut the fact of Stalinist society into a, quote, "finished stencil," end quote, in which there is room for only for capitalist state or worker state, a perfect example of the transformation of Marx's materialistic method into what it is and cannot be? The view that Marxism presents an absolute schema of an iron succession of social orders which holds good for all people and all times, which excludes any intermediate stages, any leaps over stages, any retrogression into previous stages, or any bastard social formation, distinguished from the quote, "principal epochs in the economic formation of society," end quote, and which by the same token also excludes, and that absolutely, any unique social formation interposed between capitalism and a worker state, or between a worker state and socialism, as for example the social reality which we have in the formation of the Russian bureaucratic collectivist state. That is a view that does Marx, quote, "too much honor and too much shame at the same time," end quote. Such a view necessarily converts Marx's, quote, "outline of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophical theory of the general course, fatally imposed upon all peoples, regardless of the historical circumstances in which they find themselves placed," end quote. Marx's materialist conception of history in no way, quote, "rules out," end quote, in advance by theoretical interdiction, as it were, our theory of bureaucratic collectivism. That theory was arrived at, quote, "by studying each of these evolutions separately and then comparing them," end quote, in order to, quote, "find the key," end quote, to the unique phenomenon of Stalinist society. When Marx wrote that, quote, "one will never succeed," end quote, in understanding such a social phenomenon as faces us in Russia today by means of the, quote, "master key of a historico-philosophical theory whose supreme virtue consists in being supra-historical," end quote. It was as if he foresaw the hopeless drama. the growing confusion and political impotence of those who seek to force-fit Stalinist Russia into an iron pattern for which Marx bears no responsibility. To those who charge us with a, quote, revision of Marxism, end quote, we will not retort that it is they who are revising Marxism. It suffices to reply that only those who do not understand Marx's materialist conception of history and Marx's method can attribute to him such an absolutist theoretical absurdity. Neither Marx nor Engels could foresee the actual course of the Russian proletarian revolution or the historical circumstances under which it took place. They had no need, and there were no grounds for speculative writing on the possibility of a degeneration of a proletarian revolution confined to a backward country, or on the form that this degeneration might take. In our own century, the question of degeneration of the revolution and the forms of its degeneration has been posed more than once, even before 1917. Is a classless communist society even a possibility? Can the proletarian revolution produce anything more than a victory only for the revolutionists who lead it? Best known of those who contended that the socialists may be victorious, but socialism never, was Robert Michel. In face of the reality of the Stalinist degeneration, more than one, quote, disillusioned, end quote, revolutionist, and more than one turncoat have proclaimed that Michel's theory has been confirmed by history. How have Marxists dealt with such theories as Michel's? By the simple pious assertion that an anti-capitalist but non-socialist state is an absolute impossibility, that it is ruled out theoretically by Marxism? Let us see how the problem is discussed by so authoritative a Marxist as the late Nikolai Bukharin in one of his best-known works, which was written in the earliest period of the Bolshevik Revolution and served as a textbook, so to speak, for a whole generation of Marxists. Referring to Engels, Bukharin pointed out that in all past societies there were contending classes, and therefore a ruling class because of the, quote, insufficient evolution of the productive forces, end quote. Quote, ... But communist society is a society with highly developed increased productive forces. Consequently, communist society can have no economic basis for the creation of its peculiar ruling class. For even assuming the power of the administrators to be stable, as does Michel, this power will be the power of specialists over machines, not over men. How could they in fact realize this power with regard to men? Michel neglects the fundamental decisive fact that each administratively dominant position has hitherto been an envelope for economic exploitation. The economic exploitation may not be subdivided, but there will not even exist a stable close corporation dominating the machines, for the fundamental basis of the formation of monopoly groups will disappear. What constitutes an eternal category in Michel's presentation, namely the, quote, incompetence of the masses, end quote, will disappear, for this incompetence is by no means a necessary attribute of every system. It likewise is a product of the economic and technical conditions, expressing themselves in the general cultural being and in the educational conditions. We may state that in the society of the future there will be a colossal overproduction of organizers which will nullify the stability of the ruling groups, end quote. Nikolai Bukharin, Historical Materialism, page 310. This holds, however, and in our view it holds unassailably for the communist society, one in which the productive forces have indeed been so highly developed and increased and are available in such abundance as to make even the highest level of the development of the productive forces attained by capitalism appear as miserably inadequate as it really is. But does it also hold for the transitional period of that necessarily intervenes between the end of capitalism and the full flowering of communism? Obviously not. On that score there is not, and of course there cannot be any disagreement. Quote, but the question of the transition period from capitalism to socialism, i.e. the period of the proletarian dictatorship, is far more difficult, continues Bukharin, The working class achieves victory, although it is not and cannot be a unified mass. The working class attains victory while the productive forces are going down and the great masses are materially insecure. There will inevitably result a tendency to, quote, degeneration, end quote, i.e. the excretion of a leading stratum in the form of a class germ. This tendency will be retarded by two opposing tendencies. First, by the growth of the productive forces. Second, by the abolition of the educational monopoly. By the abolition of the educational monopoly, the increasing reproduction of technologists and organizers in general out of the working class itself will undermine this possible new class alignment. The outcome of the struggle will depend on which tendencies turn out to be the stronger." End quote. Nikolai Bukharin, Historical Materialism, page 310. Take note especially of the two very precise formulations of Bukharin. One, quote, "There will inevitably result a tendency of, quote, degeneration," end quote, i.e. the excretion of a leading stratum in the form of a class germ. The excretion of a leading stratum in the form of a class germ, end quote. So far as we know, it occurred to nobody to denounce Bukharin as a, quote, revisionist, end quote, for writing this, even though he wrote it long before so much as the outlines of the present Stalinist state could be visible. Bukharin is, of course, not referring to a new capitalist class that would be excreted when he writes of a, quote, class germ, end quote. He is writing, let us remember, of Michel's theory of a new bureaucratic class that would triumph as a result of the socialist revolution, and Bukharin does not hesitate to acknowledge, this almost 30 years ago, that this is theoretically possible. Bukharin acknowledges the tendency. Bukharin promptly adds two of the counteracting tendencies. And Bukharin's conclusion? Bukharin does not even suggest that the triumph of socialism is guaranteed by some abstraction, by some absolute force. Not for a minute. Bukharin concludes, that is, Bukharin's second formulation of importance to us, quote, "The outcome of the struggle will depend on which tendencies turn out to be stronger," end quote. Or if we may formulate it in the way which excited so much horror among some self-styled, quote, monists, end quote. Quote, "The question of the perspective of Stalinism cannot be resolved in a purely theoretical way. It can be resolved only in struggle," end quote. The theoretical tradition of Marxism is represented in the manner in which Bukharin deals with the problem, but not at all in the manner in which the, quote, monists, end quote, reject the, quote, pluralism, end quote, which they ascribe to us. Marx wrote before the Russian Revolution, and Bukharin wrote before the Stalinist society appeared as an organized role, and even before Stalinism itself made its appearance. The Trotskyist opposition has been the eyewitness of the rise of Stalinism, and has been the only one to make a serious analysis of Stalinism. Next to Trotsky, the late Christian Rakovsky was the outstanding leader of the Trotskyist movement. After expulsion from the party and exile, Rakovsky wrote many penetrating analyses of Russian society under Stalinism. Given the conditions of his existence in that period, many, if not most, of his studies are probably irretrievably lost, but we have sufficient indication of the trend taken by his analysis prior to his tragic capitulation. Writing about, quote, "the life of the exiled and imprisoned Russian opposition," end quote, M. Larkin, Leon Sedov, or Trotsky's son, gave the following information, quote, "Concerning the bureaucracy, Comrade Rakovsky writes, quote, under our very eyes there has been formed and is still being formed a large class of rulers which has that class of rulers' own interior groupings. Multiplied by means of premeditated co-optation, direct or indirect, bureaucratic promotion, fictitious system of elections, the basic support of this original class is an original sort of private property, namely the possession of state power. The bureaucracy, quote, possesses the state as private property," end quote, wrote Marx. Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law. This was published in The Militant, December 1st, 1930. There is furthermore ample evidence to show that Rakovsky's view was supported not by a few of the Trotskyists exiled and imprisoned by Stalin. The whole of Rakovsky's analysis is not at hand, neither are the whole of his conclusions, and it may well be that we shall never see them, but the trend of his analysis is sufficiently clear. The Stalinist bureaucracy is a new class based upon, quote, an original sort of private property, end quote. It is a ruling class that derives its power from its complete domination of the state, which owns all the means of production and exchange. Whatever may have been the thoughts which preceded or succeeded this section from Rakovsky's manuscript, which Markin quotes, which I guess is Leon Sedov, which Leon Sedov quotes, it is plain enough that Rakovsky's point of view is, if not identical to our own, at least analogous to it. Yet the publication of Rakovsky's view as long ago as 1930 did not bring down upon his head any such puerile denunciations of, quote, revisionism, end quote, as we hear today. Finally, Trotsky himself, he held, of course, to the position that Stalinist Russia still represented a worker state, even in a degenerated form. He denied that Stalinist Russia represented either a capitalist state or a new social formation like bureaucratic collectivism. But Trotsky did not exclude the theoretical possibility that a bureaucratic collectivist state could come into existence. At the very beginning of the war, on September 25, 1939, Trotsky warned, quote, "Might we not place ourselves in a ludicrous position if we affix to the Bonapartist oligarchy the nomenclature of a new ruling class just a few years or a few months prior to this Bonapartist oligarchy's inglorious downfall," end quote. Trotsky firmly expected the solution of the problem of Stalinism by means of the triumph of the revolutionary proletariat in direct connection with the crises of the World War. That is completely clear in his polemics against us in 1939 to 40. Quote, "If this war provokes, as we firmly believe, a proletarian revolution, it must inevitably lead to the overthrow of the bureaucracy in the USSR and regeneration of Soviet democracy on a far higher economic and cultural basis than in 1918. In that case, the question whether the Stalinist bureaucracy was a, quote, class or a growth on the workers' state will be automatically solved," unquote. Trotsky. Further, Trotsky wrote that, quote, "It is impossible to expect any other more favorable conditions," end quote, "for the socialist revolution than the conditions offered by the experience of our entire epoch and the current new war. But suppose the proletarian revolution does not triumph in connection with the war, and suppose the Stalinist bureaucracy maintains or even extends the Stalinist bureaucracy's power." Trotsky did not hesitate to pose this question too and to give a tentative answer to it. Quote, "If, contrary to all probabilities, the October Revolution fails during the course of the present war, or immediately thereafter to find its continuation in any of the advanced countries, and if, on the contrary, the proletariat is thrown back everywhere and on all fronts, then we should doubtless have to pose the question of revising our conception of the present epoch and its driving forces. In that case, it would be a question not of slapping a copybook label on the USSR or the Stalinist gang, but of reevaluating the world historical perspectives for the next decades, if not centuries. We have entered the epoch of social revolution in socialist society, or on the contrary, the epoch of declining society, of totalitarian bureaucracy, question mark," end quote. I'm going to repeat that. Have we entered the epoch of social revolution in socialist society, or on the contrary, the epoch of the declining society of totalitarian bureaucracy? Thus, while Trotsky rejected the theory, end quote, Trotsky. Thus, while Trotsky rejected the theory that Russia is a bureaucratic collectivist state, he did not, and as a Marxist he could not, rule out the possibility of a bureaucratic collectivist society on the basis of an a priori theory, or a, quote, monistic concept, end quote, which we are now asked to believe is Marxism. Quote, "We may have socialism, we may have Stalinism, who knows?" Quote, "We may have socialism, we may have Stalinism, who knows? Only the, quote, concreteness of the events," end quote, "will show. In the theoretical sphere, this is the most serious break possible with Marxist ideology," end quote. That's how the Socialist Workers' Party statement presents our view and condemns our view, all in the name of a muddle the Socialist Workers' Party calls monism. Why no equally derisive condemnation of Trotsky? He writes, so that anyone who reads may understand that it, quote, contrary to all probabilities, end quote, but not contrary to all quote, contrary to all probabilities, end quote, but not contrary to all possibilities, not contrary to all possibilities, that this or that or other thing does happen, or this, that, or the other thing does not happen. Quote, the concreteness of the events will show, end quote. The Marxist and undisciplined defiance of the interdiction by the Socialist Workers' Party will indeed have to pose the question, is it the epoch of socialism or the epoch of Stalinism? Different answers may be given to this question. Different conclusions may be drawn from those drawn by Trotsky, or by us, or by the Socialist Workers' Party, or by anyone else. The others are matters subject to the most objective and sober discussion. But it should be obvious that the way in which Trotsky approaches the problem is thoroughly Marxist, whereas the way in which the Socialist Workers' Party approaches the problem is mechanistic and mystical. These are not mutually exclusive and utterly non-Marxist. Excuse me. I'm going to repeat that because I feel like I read it wrong. But it should be obvious that the way in which Trotsky approaches the problem is thoroughly Marxist, whereas the way in which the Socialist Workers' Party approaches the problem is mechanistic and mystical. Parenthesis. The being mechanistic and mystical are not mutually exclusive, end parenthesis. And utterly non-Marxist. The authors of this statement are simply not at home in the theoretical tradition of Marxism. Stalinist Russia can be understood only, quote, by studying each of these evolutions separately and then comparing them, end quote. To analyze it, we need no, quote, historico-philosophical theory whose supreme virtue consists in being super-historical, end quote. We need only the, quote, master key, end quote, of historical materialism, not in the sense of a, quote, closed system crowned with an ultimate truth, end quote, but as a scientific method, as a guide to the study of the real history of the Stalinist state, as the method by which its social anatomy can be laid bare. Taking a break. Section 2. Our theory of the class character of the Stalinist state, we are admonished, represents a break with Marxism because we hold that Russia is neither working class nor capitalist but bureaucratic collectivist. But that is not the worst of our crimes. According to a Trotskyist critic, we continue to deepen our break with Marxism. In 1941, we wrote that, quote, bureaucratic collectivism is a nationally limited phenomenon appearing in history in the course of a singular conjuncture of circumstances, end quote. What has been added to this that makes our break with Marxism, quote, deeper, end quote, an analysis of the events that have occurred since 1941. The events represent an unforeseen and hitherto unanalyzed phenomenon so far as Stalinism is concerned. They are a refutation and a thorough one of the predictions made by Trotsky. Up to the outbreak of the Second World War, Stalinism represented a state that grew out of the proletarian state established by the Bolshevik Revolution. It was a successor not to capitalism but to a revolutionary workers' state. Stalinism represented a triumph over a capitalist state, but a triumph over the working class. Stalinism represented a triumph not over a capitalist state, but a triumph over the working class and the working class's revolutionary state. We may disagree on a dozen different aspects of the problem of Stalinism, but there is no conceivable basis for a difference on this simple fact. We may disagree on the conclusions to draw from the fact that the Stalinist state replaced not a capitalist state, but the state of Lenin and Trotsky, but on the fact itself there can be no disagreement. What, however, is new in the development of Stalinism since the outbreak of the war? Some people prefer not to trouble with or even remind Some people prefer not to be troubled with or even reminded of the facts which the entire world, both bourgeois and proletarian, is thinking about and discussing. It upsets them. It is much more convenient and infinitely less disturbing to repeat over and over again what was said yesterday, mumbling the same ritualistic formulae like pious people saying their beads over and over again, and always in the same order. The trouble is, whether we like it or not, there are new beads to account for. Stalinism has successfully extended its state control over new countries. The regime in such countries as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania is now identical in every respect with the regime of pre-war and post-war Stalinist Russia. In Yugoslavia, the Stalinists are in the process of establishing fundamentally the same type of state as exists in Stalinist Russia. In Poland, substantially the same holds true. In other Balkan countries where the Stalinists have gained domination, they are also engaged in establishing social regimes identical with the one that exists in Russia. The triumph of Stalinism in all these countries has not occurred in the same way and on the same basis as in Russia. In these countries, Stalinism did not succeed a proletarian revolution. In these countries, there was no revolutionary workers' state for Stalinism to crush. In these countries, Stalinism triumphed over a bourgeois state and over a subject, not a ruling proletariat. It expropriated both politically and economically the bourgeoisie and the landowning classes, or it is in the process of expropriating them, and nationalized their property. The idea that the bourgeoisie rules in any sense, be it economically, politically, socially, or in any other way, is a grotesque absurdity. This absurdity may be swallowed by some ignorant people in the radical movement, but there is not a bourgeois in the entire world, let alone a bourgeois in these countries themselves, whom you could begin to convince that his class is still in power in any sense. We doubt if it will be asserted that in the countries conquered by Stalinism, a classless socialist society exists. If the bourgeoisie is not in power in these countries, what class is in power? What class rules? Let us lay aside for the moment the question of what class rules in these countries, so long as it is agreed that the bourgeoisie does not rule. The transference of social power from one class to another is the outstanding characteristic of a revolution or a counter-revolution. Such a transfer of power has taken place in these countries. Now, if we agree, as we must, that the rule of the bourgeoisie has been overturned, if we agree, as we must, that the rule of the bourgeoisie has been overturned in these countries, and if we agree further, as we must indeed, that the state established in these countries is substantially identical, or is, at the very least, becoming identical with that which exists in Russia, and finally, if we accept the theory that Stalinist Russia represents a degenerated workers' state, then the conclusion is absolutely inescapable. A worker state, partly degenerated or wholly degenerated in any other way, has been established by Stalinism in the conquered countries of Eastern Europe. The conclusion would not necessarily alter the view that Stalinism is bureaucratic. That is granted, but it would necessarily destroy fundamentally the theory that Stalinism is counter-revolutionary, in the sense in which some Trotskyists apply that term to Stalinism. But it would necessarily destroy fundamentally the theory that Stalinism is counter-revolutionary in the sense in which some Trotskyists apply the term counter-revolutionary to Stalinism. For in the narrow Trotskyist concept, the term counter-revolutionary must be and is applied only to those social or political forces that are not merely anti-socialist and anti-working class, but by that very token, as it were, also pro-capitalist, that is, those forces which work either subjectively or objectively for the preservation of bourgeois society and the rule of the bourgeoisie. How reconcile this with the fact that Stalinism has wiped out or is wiping out the class rule of the bourgeoisie? How reconcile it with the view, which follows relentlessly from the definition, that Stalinism has established a worker state in bourgeois countries? If that altogether too much absurd word, quote, dialectics, end quote, were to be manipulated 1,000 times more skillfully than it is, it could not extricate the manipulators from their dilemma. Shit, I said that wrong. If that altogether too much abused word, quote, dialectics, end quote, were to be manipulated 1,000 times more skillfully than it is, it could not extricate the manipulators from their dilemma. Unlike the post-mortem Trotskyists, we have sought to analyze the reality by means of the materialist method and to introduce those corrections of supplements into our theory which the reality demands of us. The Stalinist state is no longer confined to Russia. Bureaucratic collectivism has been established in other countries as a result of a triumph over the capitalist class, over the capitalist state of these countries. The pseudo-Marxist who contents himself, as Lenin once remarked contemptuously, with, quote, swearing by God, end quote, finds no need to concern himself with the problem because for him the problem simply does not exist. To the serious Marxist, the problem of yesterday is posed today in a new form, that is, the future of the Stalinist state. What is the perspective of Stalinism in relation, on the one side, to the future of capitalism, and on the other side, to the perspective of socialism? We will not at this point set forth the analysis of this problem made by us in 1946. For the moment, we will only repeat one of the conclusions which the Trotskyist critic quotes. Quote, "The question of the perspective of Stalinism cannot be resolved in a purely theoretical way. It can be resolved only in struggle," end quote. And again, quote, "Whether or not Stalinism can triumph in the capitalist world cannot be denied absolutely in advance. To repeat, it is a question of struggle," end quote. These sentences, which are nothing but simple ABC, at first evoke that sarcasm which the critic expressed with such mastery. He writes, quote, "It is clear that our slogan, quote, 'socialism or barbarism,' end quote, should now be amended to read, quote, 'socialism, bureaucratic, collectivism, or barbarism,' end quote." End quote. This is a telling blow, and while we are reeling from it, stiffer blows are rained down upon us. Sarcasm is not his only strong point. Theory, philosophy, he is at home in these fields as well. We read that, quote, "In 1946, by adopting the above-quoted resolution, the Workers' Party rejected the heart of the Marxist system, its monistic concept. Marxism holds that we live in a world of law, not of pure chance. This is true not only of the natural world, but also of human society. Shachtman, as usual in passing, substitutes for Marxism an idealistic philosophy of pluralism." Shachtman, as usual in passing, substitutes for Marxism an idealistic philosophy of pluralism. We may have socialism, we may have Stalinism, who knows? Only the, quote, "concreteness of events," end quote, will show. In the theoretical sphere, this is the most serious break possible with Marxist ideology. The perspective of the Trotskyist movement based on Marx's world outlook as embodied in the Communist Manifesto is discarded by the Workers' Party in favor of an idealistic, quote, "multiple factors," end quote, concept, which is far closer to, quote, "true socialism," end quote, than to Marxism, end quote. There it is, word for word. The reader will just have to believe that it is not invented by us, but simply quoted from the original. The cross of, quote, "true socialists," end quote, who have been dead and decently buried for a good century now, we will bear without too much murmur, because it exerts not an ounce of weight upon our shoulders. As any reader who knows something about, quote, "true socialism," end quote, is aware, the only reason it was thrown in was to impress the easily impressionable with a display of erudition which an impolite smile could suffice to dispose of. But what is said about, quote, "monism," end quote, in general, and our, quote, "pluralism," end quote, in particular, that is a little too much. You avert your eyes in embarrassment at the spectacle that the section of the human race which is in the revolutionary movement can sometimes make of itself. Where does the author of the Trotskyist statement get the courage for his pugnacious illiteracy? Does he really think that there is nobody left in the world to laugh his head off at this pompous jabberwocky? This cool mauling of big words and big thoughts? It is positively painful to have to deal with such nonsense, which cannot even be termed philosophical mumbo-jumbo, because it is just plain, ordinary, uninspired, and very puerile mumbo-jumbo. But we have no choice in the matter. What is the heart of the Marxist system? What is the heart of the Marxist system? The Marxist system's monistic concept. What is our most serious possible break with Marxist, quote, "ideology," end quote? An idealistic philosophy of pluralism, which we have substituted for Marxism, and as usual in passing. And just how have we substituted pluralism for Marxism? By saying that capitalism exists as a social reality, that socialism exists, if not yet as a reality, then in any case as a perspective, and here is our sin, that Stalinism and bureaucratic collectivism exist both as a reality and as a perspective. To this we have added the other sinful thought. The perspective of Stalinism cannot be resolved in a purely theoretical way. It can be resolved only in struggle. It is wrong to deny absolutely in advance the possibility of the triumph of Stalinism in the capitalist world, because that question can be decided only in the course of struggle. That, you see, is the idealistic philosophy of pluralism. What then is monism, the heart of the Marxist system? The development of Marxian thought has known its share of, quote, monism, end quote, that our author is babbling about. Every real student of Marxism is acquainted with Friedrich Engels' polemical destruction of Eugen Düring, who, the truth is the truth, although also given to pompous phrasemongering, nevertheless stood intellectually a cubit above all ordinary phrasers. Quote, all-embracing being is one, bracket, wrote Düring, end bracket, in its self-sufficiency, has nothing alongside of it or over it. To associate a second being with it would be to make it something that it is not, namely a part or constituent of a more comprehensive whole. We extend, as it were, our unified thought like a framework, and nothing that should be comprised in this concept of unity can contain a duality within itself, nor again can anything escape being subject to this concept of unity, end quote. To which Engels replied in a famous passage, quote, if I include a shoe brush in the unity of mammals, this does not help it get lacteal glands. The unity of being, that is, the question of whether its conception as a unity is correct, is therefore precisely what was to be proved, and when Herr Düring assures us that he conceives being as a unity and not as twofold, he tells us nothing more than his own unauthoritative opinion, end quote. Engels. What is the monistic concept of Marxism? In the same anti-Düring, Engels sets forth all there is to monism, in the fundamental sense so far as Marxists are concerned. Quote, the unity of the world does not consist in its being, although its being is a precondition of its unity, as it must certainly be before it can be one. Being, indeed, is always an open question beyond the point where our sphere of observation ends. The real unity of the world consists in its materiality, and this is proved not by a few juggling phrases, but by a long and tedious development of philosophy and natural science, end quote. It is not necessary to read this passage more than once to understand that what the critic has written is pretentious gibberish, and nothing more. This is not a harsh, but a very restrained judgment. Let us amend this judgment, but only to show how restrained it really is. Let us try to surmount the insurmountable in order to see if any sense can be made out of the nonsense. In other words, is our critic actually trying to say something, and if so, what is it? By painstakingly piecing together some elements of the muddle, we may be able to find out what idea it is he is trying to convey. Our, quote, pluralism and our, quote, idealistic multiple factors concept, end quote, consist in the opinion that, quote, we may have our socialism, we may have Stalinism, who knows, end quote. In addition to our opinion that what we actually have in most of the world is capitalism. As the critic puts it so devastatingly, we hold that the old, quote, monism, end quote, should now be amended to read, quote, socialism, bureaucratic collectivism, or barbarism, end quote. Whoever says that more than one of these three is actually or theoretically possible in the course of the development of society sets himself down as a pluralist. So far, so good. And the monist, what does the monist say? The monist says, true monist that the monist is, true defender of the heart of the Marxist system that the monist is, true partisan of the perspective of the Trotskyist movement that the monist is. The monist says that the monist holds, without amendment, to quote, our slogan, end quote, and that slogan is, hold your breath, the lights are about to be turned on, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote. Blinding light, exclamation point. Pluralism equals 3 and probably more than 3. Monism equals 2. Anyone who does not understand this is an idiot, probably a congenital one. Anyone who disagrees with it, let him be aware. Let him beware, Jesus Christ. Let him beware. In their first program, Marx and Engels declared that capitalism was a historical society, that capitalism had no basis for permanent existence, that capitalism's doom was inevitable, that capitalism would be succeeded by barbarism or socialism. Marx and Engels left us with very little of a detailed picture of what socialism would be or what barbarism would be, because Marx and Engels rejected the kind of utopian and unscientific thinking that would try to paint such a picture. As Engels said, quote, "Being indeed is always an open question beyond the point where our sphere of observation ends," end quote. Our sphere of observation today is far more comprehensive than it was in the days of Marx and Engels. It includes the living phenomenon of Stalinism. Stalinism is precisely one of the forms of barbarism which has manifested itself in the course of the decay of a society which the proletariat has not yet succeeded in lifting onto a rational plane. Marx and Engels did not and could not foresee the Stalinist barbarism. What Marx and Engels could not foresee, we have the duty to see and to analyze. What does this impossible babble about, quote, monism aim to convey? That Stalinism is not a social phenomenon? That Stalinism is not a reality? That Stalinism is not a material part of the world today? Quote, "The real unity of the world consists in the world's materiality," end quote, said Engels. Stalinism is not socialism, and Stalinism is not capitalism, but it is nevertheless a material part of the real, and therefore contradictory unity of the world. Can barbarism triumph over socialism? Of course it can. Is that triumph theoretically possible? Of course it is. If you deny this, that barbarism can triumph over socialism, you convert the scientific formula, quote, "barbarism or socialism," end quote, into mere soapbox agitation, and demagogical agitation at that. Can the question of the perspective, the prospects of barbarism, quote, be resolved in a purely theoretical way, end quote? Can the question of the triumph of barbarism, quote, be denied absolutely in advance, end quote? Whoever tries to answer that question in a, quote, purely theoretical way, end quote, whoever tries to deny it, quote, absolutely in advance, end quote, reads himself out of the circle of scientific Marxist thought. He may well remain a socialist, he may well continue to favor the ideal of socialism, but he is no longer fighting for this ideal of socialism, inasmuch as he has denied theoretically and absolutely, and in advance, the very possibility of any other development except socialism. By this denial, he no longer needs to fight for socialism. It will come of itself, and socialism's triumph is absolutely guaranteed. In the same sense, is it theoretically possible that bureaucratic collectivism, the Stalinist barbarism, can triumph over capitalism? Of course it is. Can this triumph be denied absolutely in advance? Not by Marxists. But far, far more important than this is our conclusion that the perspective, again, the prospects of capitalism and socialism and Stalinism can be resolved only in struggle. But far, far more important than this is our conclusion that the perspective, again, the prospects of capitalism and socialism and Stalinism can be resolved only in struggle. How else? Whoever believes that the perspective is automatically guaranteed, one way or another, by some sort of mysterious natural process which unfolds without the decisive and determining intervention of the living struggle of the classes, there is the man who has rejected the heart of Marxism and committed the most serious break possible with Marxism. He belongs among those philosophers for whom Marx had such scorn, because those philosophers only contemplate or analyze the world, but do nothing, or find no need to do anything, to change the world. If he nevertheless calls himself a Marxist, he would do well to reflect on the teachings of the old masters on this vital point. Quote, "The question if objective truth is possible to human thoughts," bracket, Marx wrote in his famous second thesis on Feuerbach, end bracket, "is not a theoretical but a practical question. In practice, man must prove the truth, that is, the reality and force, the this-sidedness of his thought. The dispute as to the reality or unreality of a thought, which isolates itself from the praxis, is a purely scholastic question." End quote. Appendix to Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, etc. The necessity, or, if you like, the inevitability of socialism is demonstrable only in, quote, praxis, end quote. That is, it is a matter that can be resolved only, bracket, by/in, end bracket, the course of the class struggle. Quote, the empiricism of observation alone can never sufficiently prove necessity, post hoc, but not proctor hoc. This is so very correct that it does not follow from the constant rise of the morning sun that the morning sun will rise again tomorrow, and in actuality we know that a moment will come when the morning sun does not rise. Does not rise. But the proof of necessity lies in human activity, in experiment, in labor. If I can do this post hoc, it becomes identical with the proctor hoc. It becomes identical with the proctor hoc. End quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. It would be instructive to learn from our author, who seems determined to make monism synonymous with mumbo-jumbo, just how, in his view, the perspective of Stalinism will be resolved. If it is not to be resolved, as we say, quote, only in struggle, end quote, or as the early Marxists would say, in praxis, then we must conclude that the fate of Stalinism will be resolved theoretically, or by some other pure and simple thought process. Alas, if the doom of Stalinism depended only on the thought processes and in general upon the theoretical wisdom of the critic, a bright future might well be guaranteed for it. The end. Thank you for listening.